On the morning of September 19, 1944, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter stood inside the commander's cupola of his Panther tank, surveying the mist-covered, rolling terrain of eastern France with increasing tension. At 26 years old, he was already a seasoned veteran who had survived 2 brutal years on the Eastern Front, fought T-34s at Kursk, and earned an Iron Cross in battles that had tested every limit of human endurance. Yet nothing he had experienced in that inferno had prepared him for what the Americans were bringing to the battlefield in the West. They were fielding a machine so swift and so deadly that fellow German tank officers spoke about it in the same hushed, uneasy tones once used to describe the terrifying Katyusha rocket barrages. They called it the Hellcat. Richter's crew had first heard the rumors 3 weeks earlier near Nancy. A full company of Panthers, 12 tanks representing the peak of German armored design, had been conducting a controlled withdrawal when they encountered American tank destroyers. 17 minutes later, 8 of those Panthers were smoking ruins. The crews who survived reported something that sounded impossible. Enemy vehicles seemed to materialize out of nowhere, fire, and then disappear again before German crews could even return coordinated fire. One shaken gunner swore he had scored a direct hit on one of the American tank destroyers, only to watch it race away at a speed that appeared to violate every known law of physics and mechanized warfare. At first, intelligence officers dismissed the reports as exaggerations, the product of stress or confusion under fire. But then the same thing happened at Aricourt, at Lunéville, and in nearly every engagement where American armored forces clashed with German panzers. According to after-action summaries compiled by the Wehrmacht High Command, German tank crews reported average contact times of only 2 to 4 minutes before the American vehicles vanished from sight. The implications were catastrophic. In those tiny windows of engagement, the Americans were achieving kill ratios that defied classic armored doctrine. As Allied intelligence records later confirmed, the M18 Hellcat represented a complete break from traditional tank destroyer concepts. While German Jagdpanzer and even American Sherman variants favored heavier armor, the Hellcat's designers at Buick, yes, the automobile company contracted to build it, chose a completely different approach. They removed every non-essential component to fulfill a single purpose: destroy enemy armor and survive by using speed rather than armor. The result was a machine weighing only 17 tons, carrying a 76mm gun capable of punching through 4 inches of armor at 1,000 yards, powered by a 9-cylinder radial engine that drove it to 55 miles per hour on roads. Richter studied the American technical manual his intelligence section had retrieved from a destroyed Hellcat near Metz, a document also referenced in official U.S. Army records from the European theater. Its specifications seemed unreal: 55 miles per hour on roads, 35 across open terrain, and a power-to-weight ratio that made it the single fastest tracked armored vehicle of the entire war. His own Panther, impressive in its sloped armor and formidable 75mm gun, managed 25 miles per hour on paved roads under ideal circumstances. In the real conditions of war-torn France with cratered roads and thick mud, 15 was more realistic. The tactical consequences were sobering. The Panther required roughly 45 seconds to acquire a target, estimate range, and fire. Reloading took another 15 seconds. If an M18 appeared within effective combat distance, roughly 1,000 meters, and if Richter's crew performed perfectly, they might fire 2, perhaps 3 rounds. But with the Hellcat's unprecedented speed, it could cross that entire danger zone in under 90 seconds, fire its gun using the new hydraulic turret traverse system, capable of rotating a full circle in only 20 seconds, and withdraw before a third German round could even be fired. 3 minutes was all German crews truly had. The story of the Hellcat did not begin on the battlefields of Europe, But in the urgent and anxious halls of American military planning in 1941, Major General Andrew Bruce, the newly appointed commander of the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Texas, had studied the German blitzkrieg tactics that destroyed Poland and France. He reached a controversial conclusion. The solution to massed panzer assaults was not heavier armor or more tanks, but speed, firepower, and rapid tactical maneuvering concentrated in specialized tank destroyer battalions. Bruce's philosophy, outlined in official tank destroyer doctrine and training publications of the time, challenged conventional thinking. While British and Soviet designers built increasingly heavily armored vehicles, Bruce envisioned fast, lightly armored platforms that would operate like naval destroyers, hence the name, rushing to intercept and neutralize enemy armor breakthroughs before they could exploit gaps in American lines. The development contract was awarded to Buick Motor Division, part of General Motors' vast wartime industrial transformation. The project's chief engineer, J. Edward Campbell, a former racing car designer, approached the task with an automotive rather than a traditional military mindset. Where tank designers generally began with armor thickness and added mobility afterward, Campbell inverted the process. He started with the chassis of a modified M24 Chaffee light tank, stripped off weight wherever possible, and posed a revolutionary question: how fast can we make it? The answer arrived at the Detroit Arsenal in July 1943. The T-70 prototype, which would eventually enter service as the M18, weighed 17 tons compared to the Sherman's 30 or the Panther's 45. Its Continental R975 aircraft engine produced 400 horsepower. During initial trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the prototype reached speeds so high that observers believed the speedometers were broken. According to U.S. Army Ordnance Department records from the time, engineers initially feared the suspension would not withstand the strain. But Campbell had incorporated racing innovations directly from the Indianapolis circuit. Buick began full production in January 1944 at its facility in Flint, Michigan. The same assembly lines that once built automobiles produced the first combat-ready Hellcats in March. By the time Allied forces stormed Normandy on June 6, 1944, the first M18-equipped tank destroyer battalions were arriving in England. Ultimately, the European theater would receive more than 2,400 Hellcats, organized into battalions that enjoyed a degree of operational independence rarely seen in the traditionally rigid structure of the U.S. Army. The soldiers selected for the Hellcat battalions received specialized training that stressed boldness, initiative, and fast decision-making. Unlike conventional tank units that fought in coordinated formations alongside infantry, tank destroyer doctrine required commanders to locate enemy armor, race into advantageous firing positions, attack from ambush, and escape before the enemy could deliver effective counterfire. The tank destroyer force's official motto, "Seek, Strike, and Destroy," was not empty rhetoric. It was the essence of their operational philosophy condensed into 3 words. Lieutenant Marcus Webb of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion experienced his first combat in an M18 on August 12, 1944, during the American breakout from Normandy. His battalion was positioned near Argenton when German forces launched a counterattack involving elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. Webb's platoon, 5 Hellcats operating independently, intercepted a column of 8 Panzer IV tanks moving to reinforce the German line. The battle lasted just 11 minutes. Webb's after-action report, now preserved in the National Archives World War II collection, describes a fluid engagement in which his platoon used speed and maneuver to control every aspect of the fight. His Hellcat would rush to firing positions along the flanks of the German formation, fire several rounds, and then accelerate away before the German tanks could bring their heavier guns to bear. Whenever the German tanks tried to turn and face the threat, other Hellcats would suddenly appear from different directions, turning the battle into a fast-moving, 3-dimensional chess match fought at 50 miles per hour. All 8 German tanks were destroyed. Webb's unit lost one Hellcat to a thrown track, damage caused by rough terrain, not enemy fire, and 2 crewmen were wounded by shell fragments. Sergeant Thomas Morrison climbed into his M18's turret on a cold October morning in 1944 near the French town of Bruyères, going through the practiced pre-combat preparations that separated skilled tank destroyer crews from mere vehicle operators. The Hellcat required different instincts than standard tanks, and Morrison, a former stock car mechanic from Georgia, had exactly the mix of mechanical understanding and aggressive confidence the vehicle demanded. Its fighting compartment was cramped, open-topped, and protected by armor that could not stop anything larger than rifle-caliber rounds. The design philosophy behind it was brutally clear. If enemy shells were impacting your vehicle, you had already made a tactical mistake. The Hellcat survived by never being in the same place long enough for return fire to find it. That open turret, which looked like a weakness, provided major advantages. It reduced overall weight, vastly improved situational awareness, and allowed quicker ammunition handling. In the dense forests and narrow villages of Europe, being able to hear approaching enemy armor before visually spotting it could determine who ambushed whom. Morrison's crew consisted of 5 men, each trained to fill multiple roles. The driver, Corporal James Kowalski, could maneuver the Continental engine over terrain that would stop heavier tanks. His feel for the Hellcat's torsion bar suspension was uncanny. He said he could sense when the vehicle was telling him where the stable ground lay. Private Danny Chen, the assistant driver, manned the bow machine gun, but spent most battles scanning for threats and identifying escape routes. His role required him to think several moves ahead. In the turret, the gunner and loader functioned in a synchronized rhythm that determined the crew's survival. Corporal Marcus Washington, the gunner, had attended artillery school before volunteering for tank destroyer duty. He possessed an intuitive grasp of ballistics, estimating range, wind, and target movement in seconds. His loader, Private First Class Antonio Rodriguez, could reload the 76mm M1A2 gun in under 10 seconds, even when the Hellcat was bouncing across uneven ground at 30 miles per hour. The 76mm M1A2 gun represented a pinnacle of American wartime engineering. Technical specifications in U.S. Army Field Manual 3-40 for the M18 showed that it fired armor-piercing rounds at 2,800 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, roughly 900 meters, it could pierce 4 inches of vertical armor. That was enough to defeat the frontal armor of German Panzer IVs and the side armor of Panthers and Tigers. The hydraulic turret traverse system, adapted from naval gun mounts, enabled a full 360-degree rotation in 20 seconds, far faster than earlier American tank destroyers that relied on manual cranks. But the true innovation was not the gun itself, it was the way Hellcat crews used it. Traditional tank doctrine emphasized head-on engagements where armor and gunpowder determined the winner. Hellcat doctrine abandoned this idea entirely. Morrison and his fellow commanders trained to use speed and maneuver to secure flank or rear shots, the vulnerable zones even the heaviest German tanks could not protect. The Hellcat was never meant to go toe-to-toe with a Panther. It was engineered to appear on its flank, fire a killing shot, and vanish before the enemy could react. The tactical approach, shaped by months of training and refined through combat experience, followed a predictable pattern. Reconnaissance units identified enemy armor. A Hellcat platoon, usually 5 vehicles, used its superior speed to position itself ahead of the German advance or slip behind German lines. They established ambush locations with carefully pre-planned escape routes. When German tanks arrived, the Hellcats opened fire from the sides or rear at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters, close enough to guarantee penetration, but far enough to leave time to escape. The critical moment came immediately after firing. While German crews were still trying to identify the direction of the attack, Hellcat drivers were already accelerating away, using terrain and their planned routes to break line of sight. By the time German tanks turned their turrets and prepared to return fire, the Hellcat would already be 300 meters away and gathering speed. 60 seconds later, it would be behind a ridge or tree line, shifting into position for another attack from a new direction. Morrison had perfected this deadly choreography through 15 separate engagements. His crew moved with the precision of a racing pit crew. They had proven that speed was not only a function of the engine, it was also the speed at which targets were identified, rounds fired accurately, and escape maneuvers executed. His fastest recorded engagement time was 7 seconds from spotting the target to firing the first round. In Hellcat doctrine, 7 seconds was considered slow. Some crews managed to fire within 5 seconds. Meanwhile, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber sat in the basement of a requisitioned farmhouse near Metz, reviewing after-action reports that painted an increasingly bleak picture of German armored operations in the West. As the intelligence officer of the 11th Panzer Division, Weber's responsibility was to identify patterns in battlefield reports and propose countermeasures. The trend emerging from the documents in front of him contradicted every principle of armored warfare he had been taught during his training at the Panzer School in Münster. The numbers themselves revealed a reality that German High Command refused to openly acknowledge. During September 1944 alone, German armored units in France had lost over 300 tanks of various types. American M18 Hellcat battalions, fewer than 200 vehicles across the entire region, were credited with roughly 130 confirmed tank kills. The kill-to-loss ratio was approaching 8-1 in favor of the Hellcats. For a military force that had built its prestige on tank superiority, these results represented something far more unsettling than a series of isolated tactical setbacks. They suggested that the core concepts of armored warfare were being overturned by American innovation. Weber's analysis, parts of which survived in Wehrmacht records later captured by U.S. forces, pinpointed the fundamental problem. German panzer doctrine had been shaped on the Eastern Front, where battles often unfolded across open steppe terrain at distances of 1,500 meters or more. At such long ranges, armor thickness and gun penetration dictated the outcome. The Panther's 75mm cannon could destroy a Soviet T-34 from 2,000 meters. The Tiger's 88mm could kill targets nearly 3,000 meters away. These machines were designed to fight and win engagements where opponents were visible from a kilometer out. But the terrain of Western Europe, Normandy's hedgerows, the forests of the Vosges, and the tight streets of countless towns reduced typical engagement ranges to 300 meters or less. At such distances, the Hellcat's thin armor stopped mattering, while its speed and agility became decisive. A Panther that required 45 seconds to acquire and fire at a target had no chance against a Hellcat that could aim and fire in 7 seconds and disappear in 30. The mathematics of survival were brutally clear. In a standard engagement scenario Weber studied, a Hellcat platoon would set up an ambush on a likely German approach path. When German tanks appeared, the first sign of American presence would be armor-piercing rounds already striking their vehicles. German commanders needed about 15 seconds to determine the direction of the attack, pass orders to the crew, and prepare to retaliate. The Panther's turret traverse rate, 15 degrees per second using the hand crank system, required an additional 6 to 8 seconds to bring the gun onto target. In those 23 seconds, the Hellcats could fire twice, possibly 3 times if the loader worked exceptionally fast. And before German gunners could fire even a single ranging shot, the Hellcat would be accelerating out of danger. At full throttle, the Hellcat could reach 30 miles per hour in roughly 12 seconds. By the time German tank crews coordinated their response and fired their initial shot, the Hellcat would already be 200 meters away and partially obscured by terrain or vegetation. German return fire times averaged between 120 and 180 seconds, 2 to 3 minutes. The Hellcat's exposure in the danger zone typically lasted only 35 to 50 seconds. In practical terms, the window in which German forces could deliver effective counterfire barely existed. Weber proposed several countermeasures in his reports: wider vehicle spacing to reduce the impact of ambushes, advanced security elements to scout ahead of the main column, closer cooperation with infantry to clear likely ambush sites, and heavier reliance on indirect fire, mortars and artillery to saturate suspected Hellcat positions. Every one of these measures had been attempted. None solved the problem. On the morning of October 24, 1944, freezing rain fell across the Vosges Mountains, where Lieutenant Marcus Webb's platoon of Hellcats from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion lay concealed along a ridge overlooking the approach to Saint-Dié. The weather was miserable, the visibility poor, and that made conditions ideal for hunting. German armor trying to navigate the mountain passes would be forced into predictable paths, their usual advantages in armor and long-range firepower negated by the terrain and weather. Webb positioned his 5 Hellcats in carefully prepared fighting positions, each one taking advantage of the terrain along the ridge. Every vehicle had a primary firing position with a clear view of the road below, plus 2 alternate firing points connected by routes their drivers had memorized in the dark. The spacing between positions ensured German artillery could not suppress multiple Hellcats at once, while still allowing the platoon to concentrate fire on any target in the valley. Their escape routes led over the reverse slope of the ridge, enabling them to break contact and reposition before German observers could direct effective fire. Radio intercepts suggested that a German armored column was moving to reinforce positions farther north. The division's intelligence estimate predicted a company-sized force, likely 12 to 15 tanks, probably a mix of Panthers and Panzer IVs. Webb's platoon would not attempt to destroy the entire column head-on. They would wait for the leading vehicles to enter the valley, destroy the first 2 or 3 to block the road, then target the vehicles at the rear to prevent withdrawal. This would trap the entire German formation in the narrow valley, unable to advance or retreat, while Webb's Hellcats methodically destroyed them from positions beyond the Germans' effective engagement capability. The German column appeared at 7:40 a.m. as predicted. Webb counted 17 vehicles, 4 Panthers in front, followed by a mix of Panzer IVs and what appeared to be several Jagdpanzer IVs at the rear. The Germans were moving cautiously, which was sensible, but caution offered little protection when forced through a narrow mountain pass, with enemies occupying the high ground. Webb waited until the lead Panther was directly below his position, about 600 meters away. At that angle in distance, the Hellcat's 76mm gun would tear through the Panther's top armor with ease. He ordered his gunner to fire, and Corporal Washington sent the first shot downrange. The armor-piercing round slammed into the Panther's engine deck, bringing the vehicle to a halt as smoke poured from its vents. Before the German crew could abandon the tank, another Hellcat fired, striking the rear hull. The Panther erupted in flames. The other Hellcats opened fire according to their practiced sequence. The 4th vehicle in the German column, a Panzer IV, was hit in the turret ring, freezing its turret in place. The rearmost vehicle, one of the Jagdpanzer IVs, took around to the engine compartment and burst into flames. The German formation was now locked in place, unable to advance past the burning Panther or reverse past the destroyed tank destroyer. What followed demonstrated textbook tank destroyer tactics. Over the next 42 minutes, according to Webb's after-action report, preserved in U.S. Army archives, his platoon systematically engaged the immobilized German vehicles. The Hellcats would fire from one position, then immediately relocate to an alternate before German return fire could arrive. German crews attempted to coordinate a response, but the combination of poor visibility, difficult terrain, and the Hellcats' high mobility prevented them from delivering effective fire. German tank commanders could not keep visual contact with the American vehicles long enough to coordinate a meaningful response. By the time a Panther located a Hellcat's firing position and rotated its turret to engage, the American vehicle had already disappeared, only to reappear seconds later from an entirely different direction. The psychological impact of this was severe. German crews found themselves fighting an enemy they could not pin down, could not predict, and could not outrun. Oberst Gustav Hoffmann had been commanding panzer units since the invasion of Poland in 1939. He had survived 3 brutal winters on the Eastern Front and earned the German Cross in Gold for his leadership during the retreat after Kursk. He had faced Soviet armor countless times in situations where even small tactical mistakes meant instant death. He had developed instincts that had kept him alive for 5 years of war, and trained many young panzer officers in the unforgiving realities of tank combat. The American Hellcat forced him to reconsider everything he believed he understood about armored warfare. His battalion first encountered Hellcats near Lunéville on September 18, 1944. The entire engagement lasted 19 minutes and cost Hoffmann 7 Panthers, nearly half his operational strength, in exchange for just 1 American vehicle, disabled only because of a lucky hit that damaged its transmission. The after-action analysis made the problem undeniable. His Panthers were superb machines designed for a war that the Americans had effectively replaced with an entirely new kind of conflict. Traditional German advantages had become liabilities. On the Eastern Front, Hoffmann had learned that tank battles were determined by 4 main factors: firepower, armor protection, crew proficiency, and numerical advantage. German tanks generally possessed superiority in the first 2 categories. Soviet forces often had the advantage in numbers and sometimes in crew resilience. The outcome depended on which side managed to exploit its strengths most effectively. This equation had held true in countless battles from Smolensk to Kharkov to Kursk. The Hellcat introduced a 5th factor that upended the entire formula: speed, used simultaneously as a weapon and as protection. Hoffmann studied American tank destroyer doctrine through captured manuals and prisoner interrogations from Hellcat units, documented in German intelligence reports from the period. The American approach rejected nearly every foundational element of German armored doctrine. Where German tanks advanced in tight formations with overlapping fields of fire, Hellcats operated in loose, dispersed groupings, where individual vehicles acted semi-independently. Where German doctrine stressed holding ground and defending fixed positions, American tank destroyers treated every location as temporary, staying in place only long enough to fire before rapidly relocating. The most troubling discovery was how American crews consistently used their vehicles' speed to seize the initiative by delivering the first shot. In Hoffmann's experience, tank battles were almost always won by the side that spotted the enemy first and fired accurately before the opponent had time to react. German optics and training typically gave them an advantage in target acquisition, but this meant very little when Hellcats were already hidden in position, waiting to spring an ambush before German forces even entered the engagement area. Hoffmann began implementing changes based on his analysis. He reorganized his battalion into smaller, more widely spaced formations to make it harder for Hellcats to ambush entire columns. He increased reconnaissance patrols, using infantry and light vehicles to scout ahead before committing his valuable Panthers. Most critically, he trained his crews to value rapid firing over perfect accuracy. Better to fire quickly with an imperfect sight picture than to spend precious seconds trying to achieve a perfect shot that would never come because the target was already gone. These updated tactics produced limited results. In a clash near Château Salins on October 9, 1944, Hoffmann's battalion encountered a platoon of Hellcats attempting to move into ambush positions. His lead tanks spotted the Americans, a rare occurrence, and opened fire immediately, forcing the Hellcats to retreat before completing their setup. One Hellcat was destroyed, another was damaged, and the remaining vehicles withdrew. It was the first instance in which Hoffman's battalion achieved better than an even exchange against the American tank destroyers. December 1944 brought one of the coldest winters in decades to the Ardennes. With it came Hitler's last major gamble, what the Allies would later call the Battle of the Bulge. For Hellcat battalions scattered across the American defensive line, the German offensive posed challenges unlike anything they had faced during the pursuit across France. This time, the Americans were defending. German forces had numerical superiority, and the frozen ground restricted some of the mobility advantages that made the Hellcat so lethal. The 634th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats, was rushed to the town of St. Vith on December 17, 1944, to help contain the German breakthrough. Captain James Thornton, the battalion's operations officer, watched from an observation point on a hillside as elements of the 6th Panzer Army advanced westward, the largest concentration of German armor he had seen since Normandy. The numbers were staggering. Intelligence estimated more than 200 German tanks in the assault waves moving toward American positions. The tactical situation was unlike anything the Hellcats had experienced. Instead of roaming the open fields of France hunting German armor, the tank destroyers would have to fight from prepared defensive positions. Instead of hit-and-run ambush tactics, they would have to hold key road junctions against overwhelming odds. The weather grounded Allied aircraft, eliminating one of America's major advantages. The frozen soil made it difficult to dig in, and heavy snowfall reduced the visibility usually exploited by the Hellcat's open turret. Thornton arranged his Hellcats to protect the vital road network converging on St. Vith. Each platoon received a specific sector to cover, with firing positions chosen to maximize the M18's firepower while minimizing exposure to German guns. The plan relied on trading space for time, allowing German forces to advance into prepared kill zones, inflicting as much damage as possible, then falling back to secondary positions before German troops could gather enough strength to overwhelm the thin American defenses. The German assault struck Thornton's defensive line at dawn on December 18th. The attacking force included Panthers and Panzer IVs from elite Waffen-SS formations, backed by infantry and assault guns. The Germans advanced with the disciplined precision of veteran units executing a carefully planned operation. But as they entered the approaches to St. Vith, they encountered the same terrifying pattern that had plagued German armored commanders since Normandy. Hellcats emerging from unexpected angles, firing with lethal precision and disappearing before any coordinated response could be organized. Staff Sergeant Raymond Cooper commanded one of Thornton's Hellcats positioned at a vital crossroads south of St. Vith. From his position overlooking a valley the Germans needed to cross, Cooper's crew had arrived the night before and dug their Hellcat into a hull-down position using the frozen ground, exposing only the turret. They had also prepared 2 alternate firing positions, marking the connecting approach routes with strips of white tape visible in the snow. The German column appeared around 0630, a company of Panthers advancing in formation with infantry in support. Cooper allowed them to approach to within 800 meters, well inside the effective range of the 76mm gun, before giving the order to fire. His first round struck the lead Panther in the glacis plate, the armor-piercing shell punching through and detonating the ammunition inside. The tank erupted in a violent explosion, blocking the road and forcing the rest of the column to halt. Cooper's loader, Private First Class Antonio Rodriguez, had already slammed another round into the breach. The second shot hit the Panther behind the lead vehicle, piercing the turret and killing the crew. Before the Germans could pinpoint Cooper's position, his driver had already thrown the Hellcat into motion, racing along the pre-planned route to the second firing point 200 meters away. The entire sequence, 2 shots, 2 kills, and movement to the alternate position took 38 seconds. This same pattern repeated again and again throughout the day. The Hellcats struck from prepared positions, inflicted casualties, and withdrew before German forces could bring meaningful return fire onto their location. Even in a defensive battle, the M18's speed remained a decisive asset. Unlike towed anti-tank guns or slower tank destroyers, which could be overwhelmed once German forces identified their locations, the Hellcats could fire and relocate before enemy artillery could adjust its aim, or tanks could return fire accurately. Lieutenant Carl Schmidt had joined the 9th SS Panzer Division in November 1944, a newly trained officer with no combat experience. His battalion commander, a decorated veteran with 4 years of frontline service, gave Schmidt advice that contradicted nearly everything he had been taught. When facing American tank destroyers, survival required rejecting the tactical principles he had been instructed to follow. "The Americans do not fight the way we trained you to fight. Adapt or die," the commander said. Schmidt first encountered Hellcats on January 7, 1945, during the German retreat from the Ardennes. His platoon of 4 Panthers was covering the withdrawal of infantry when reports came in of American armor approaching from the rear. Schmidt deployed his tanks in a textbook defensive layout, interlocking fields of fire, clear sight lines, and protected flanks, exactly as prescribed in the manuals. Hellcats appeared from 3 different directions at once, a coordinated ambush that turned Schmidt's flawless defensive formation into a killing zone. The first sign of the enemy was an armor-piercing round punching through his wingman's Panther from the rear deck, igniting the engine. Before Schmidt could issue a single fire command, a second Panther was hit from another direction, the shot jamming its turret ring. The third Panther had begun rotating its turret toward one of the American firing positions, but the Hellcat had already moved and reappeared seconds later from behind a farmhouse 400 meters away. Schmidt's own Panther, the 4th in the formation, survived only because his driver reacted instantly. Without waiting for orders, he threw the heavy vehicle into reverse and sped backward behind a stone barn. An armor-piercing shell struck the ground where the Panther had been moments earlier. The driver continued reversing, using the barn as cover, then pivoted the tank and accelerated away from the ambush. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes. 3 Panthers were destroyed, 1 escaped. Schmidt never fired a shot. He never even saw the American vehicles clearly. In his after-action report, later recovered from German archives, Schmidt wrote, "The American tank destroyers do not engage in battle. They execute. There is no fight, only killing." His words captured the essence of Hellcat tactics. Traditional military language struggled to describe what the Americans were doing. Conventional armored battles involved 2 sides maneuvering, firing, and trying to create an advantage. Hellcat operations eliminated the mutual aspect of combat. The Americans imposed their will through speed, positioning, and surprise, creating engagements where German forces almost had no ability to respond. It was not a contest, it was systematic destruction. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht had implemented more effective countermeasures against Hellcat tactics, as documented in captured German training bulletins. Recommendations included more dispersed formations, increased reconnaissance, preemptive artillery fire on likely ambush zones, and immediate withdrawal upon contact instead of attempting to fight. In essence, German doctrine now admitted that Panthers could not defeat Hellcats in direct engagements and advised avoiding combat with them whenever possible. This represented a stunning psychological shift for an army whose reputation had been built on bold armored assaults. The blitzkrieg strategy that crushed Poland, France, and initially the Soviet Union revolved around concentrated tank attacks, punching through weak points and exploiting breakthroughs. Now, German forces were being instructed to avoid a particular American vehicle type entirely, to treat contact with Hellcats as a reason to pull back, not engage. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but the Hellcat's influence on armored warfare lasted far beyond the final battles. The M18 proved that speed and firepower could, in some situations, substitute for armor. According to official U.S. Army statistics compiled after the war, M18 battalions achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored unit in the European theater, around 4-1 overall, with some battalions surpassing 8-1. The 9th 04th Tank Destroyer Battalion, one of the most successful Hellcat units, was credited with destroying over 600 German armored vehicles during 11 months of fighting from Normandy to Germany. The battalion lost 53 Hellcats during the same period, about 40 to enemy action, and the rest to mechanical issues or accidents. This marked a complete shift in the understanding of armored warfare, one where survival no longer depended on absorbing enemy fire, but on avoiding it entirely through superior speed. German accounts preserved in post-war interviews with surviving Panzer commanders revealed just how psychologically overwhelming it was to face the Hellcat. Oberst Hoffmann, who survived the conflict, described the experience in his 1953 memoir. He wrote that the M18 was not just another weapon. It embodied an entirely different philosophy of armored combat, one their own doctrine was fundamentally unequipped to counter. German training emphasized victory through superior armor, greater firepower, and highly drilled crews. The Americans demonstrated that speed and tactical agility could overcome all three. The Hellcat's open-topped turret, something traditional military thinkers initially viewed as a major flaw, turned out to be a significant advantage. Leaving the turret unarmored saved roughly 3 tons that would otherwise have been consumed by metal plating. This weight reduction allowed for higher top speeds and faster acceleration. The open turret also greatly enhanced situational awareness, enabling crews to detect enemy movement sooner and coordinate reactions more rapidly. In the terrain of Western Europe, where most tank engagements occurred at under 800 meters, the Hellcat's thin armor made little difference. Any German tank gun scoring a hit would penetrate regardless of how thick the Hellcat's armor was. Post-war studies conducted by the U.S. Army's Armored Board, outlined in their 1946 technical reports, identified 4 primary reasons behind the Hellcat's battlefield success. First was its extraordinary power-to-weight ratio, which produced unmatched mobility. Second was the hydraulic turret traverse system that enabled rapid targeting in any direction. Third was the 76mm gun, effective against German armor at the engagement distances typical in Western Europe. Finally, and arguably most importantly, was the tactical doctrine that turned these advantages into consistent, repeatable victories. The Hellcat shaped armored vehicle development around the world after the war. The idea that light, fast, heavily armed vehicles should be tailored to specific tactical missions rather than built as general-purpose machines became a foundational principle in many armies. Tanks such as the French AMX-13, the Soviet ASU-85, and later the American M551 Sheridan all incorporated concepts learned from the M18's battlefield performance. The emphasis on speed as a defensive asset, on maintaining high power-to-weight ratios, and on designing vehicles for specialized combat roles can all be traced back to lessons the Hellcat taught in 1944 and 1945. To the German tankers who fought against them, the M18 Hellcat represented far more than a formidable anti-tank platform. It symbolized the moment when American industrial capability and innovative doctrine fused to produce solutions that traditional German armored thinking was unable to defeat. The mere 3 minutes German crews had to engage a Hellcat before it disappeared at 55 miles per hour became emblematic of a broader strategic reality. In modern warfare, speed and adaptability could overcome armor and firepower when paired with the right tactical approach. The last time M18 Hellcats saw combat with U.S. forces was during the Korean War. Several battalions were deployed in 1950 to counter North Korean armored formations. Although Korea's mountainous landscape differed sharply from Europe, the Hellcat's mobility again proved invaluable. In the early months of fighting, M18 units scored major successes against Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks. The 773rd Tank Destroyer Battalion alone was credited with destroying more than 50 enemy tanks during the defense of the Pusan perimeter. Staff Sergeant Thomas "Red" Morrison, who had commanded a Hellcat in Europe and volunteered to serve again in Korea, found himself back inside an M18 turret near the Naktong River in August 1950. The tactical situation was the opposite of what he had experienced in France. Now American forces were holding defensive positions against a numerically superior armored force, but the core principles remained unchanged. Morrison's crew would prepare positions in advance, let North Korean T-34s move into predetermined kill zones, strike from the flank or rear, and then relocate before the enemy had time to organize a coherent response. The engagement patterns Morrison encountered in Korea confirmed the lessons he had learned in Europe. Speed remained the Hellcat's primary source of protection. Its ability to rapidly relocate kept enemy forces disoriented and prevented them from focusing their firepower on any single vehicle. The 76mm gun, which had already proven itself against German Panthers, easily penetrated the armor of T-34s at the typical ranges where fighting occurred. The open-topped turret, criticized by some military planners as outdated, continued to offer significant tactical benefits, especially in awareness and quick communication among the crew. Yet the Korean War also highlighted the limits of the Hellcat within a rapidly changing era of armored warfare. By 1950, the M18 was already behind the curve compared to newer armored vehicles entering service. The introduction of Soviet heavy tanks later in the conflict, such as the IS-2 and IS-3, created threats the Hellcat's gun could no longer reliably counter. The 76mm weapon, fully adequate against most German vehicles of World War II, struggled to penetrate the improved frontal armor of these post-war Soviet designs. The last American M18 battalion was deactivated in 1953, shortly after the Korean armistice. Around the same time, the entire tank destroyer concept was phased out of U.S. doctrine. Post-war studies concluded that specialized tank destroyer units were unnecessary in an era when main battle tanks could perform anti-armor duties while also fulfilling general combat requirements. Vehicles like the M48 Patton replaced the Hellcat, offering a combination of armor, firepower, and mobility in one platform capable of handling multiple battlefield roles. Still, the Hellcat's influence did not disappear. Several countries acquired surplus M18s after the war, with some keeping them in service well into the 1970s and even the 1980s. The Yugoslav People's Army operated Hellcats until 1972, valuing their agility in mountainous regions. Nationalist Chinese forces on Taiwan used them into the mid-1960s, considering them an affordable option for coastal defense. Venezuela maintained a small number of M18s until 1975, mostly for training rather than actual combat. Veterans who had crewed Hellcats during World War II remembered more than technical specifications. To them, the vehicle embodied something unique in military history, a machine so perfectly matched to its tactical doctrine that it performed far beyond what its simple armor and gun would suggest. At reunions of tank destroyer battalions throughout the late 20th century, former crews spoke not about the engineering details, but about the sense of confidence the Hellcat gave them. Knowing they could outrun anything they couldn't outfight created a morale advantage just as important as its firepower or speed. Technical historians analyzing the M18 identified several innovations that later influenced armored vehicle development. The use of lightweight, high-strength steel in the hull anticipated post-war advances in tank materials. The hydraulic turret traverse system, adapted from naval technology, demonstrated the value of borrowing ideas from other branches of the military. The emphasis on automotive engineering principles, thanks in part to Campbell's background in race car design, showed that civilian expertise could solve military challenges in ways traditional thinking often overlooked. The story of German tank crews having only 3 minutes to engage a Hellcat before it disappeared at 55 miles per hour became legendary. It is still cited in militaries around the world as an example of how creative tactics can overcome apparent disadvantages in firepower or armor. The M18 proved that warfare was not solely about heavier guns and thicker armor. Sometimes victory depended on being gone before the enemy could shoot, on controlling the terms of battle, using speed, maneuver, and cunning instead of brute force. In quiet corners of military museums across the United States, restored M18 Hellcats stand as reminders of a brief moment when innovation, doctrine, and execution aligned perfectly. They appear small next to modern main battle tanks. Their open turrets look exposed, their thin armor inadequate. But the veterans who fought in them knew the truth. The Hellcat wasn't built to withstand hits. It was built to ensure the hits never landed. In that narrow tactical role, at that specific moment in history, it was as close to perfect as any weapon system ever created. Its legacy endures in the core principles that guided its use. Understand your strengths, exploit the enemy's vulnerabilities, choose when and where to fight, and live to fight another day. These were not merely instructions for a particular vehicle. They were timeless lessons of warfare that the M18 Hellcat demonstrated with deadly clarity across 2 different conflicts. For the German tank crews who faced them, those 3 minutes before the Hellcat vanished at full speed must have felt like an eternity. And for many, it was the last eternity they ever experienced.